Now, as first speaker, I'd like to make a few observations. First being that in looking at good versus harm, we cannot simply look at the good and harm done to America. We have to look at the good and harm done to the regions on which America has enacted its foreign policy objectives. And second of all, that long-term stability is a prerequisite for a sustainable standard of living. According to the Council of Brevin, long-term stability facilitates gender, racial, and ethnic equity, as well as political participation. And in looking at how America has done good or harm on the regions of which foreign policy objectives have been enacted, we have to look at how America has impacted long-term stability in the region. So let's look at our 3 points we'll be discussing today. First of all, by the creation of a unified Islamic terrorist group, America has forced a coalition between Israel and the Arab states, which actually is good for long-term stability. Second of all, due to America's militaristic policies, many countries are pushing back against American intervention, allowing them to take a more active role in their own domestic policies. And finally, due to America's foreign policy plans, America is losing its hegemonic power, which is a good thing because hegemony is bad for the weaker countries as well as for the hegemon in itself. So let's look at the first point, that by creating an Islamic state called ISIS in Syria and the Middle East, America has forced agreements between the Middle Eastern countries, the Arab world, and Israel. According to Steve Inskeep, correspondent for National Public Radio, in October 2014, America has actually created ISIS due to its foreign policy objectives after the 9/11 attacks, the war on terror. By going after al-Qaeda's leaders, they forced them into Syria, where they were able to create a groundwork of Islamic terrorism, which erupted after the Arab Spring. Now, ironically, this is actually a unifying factor for the Middle East, because Islamic terrorism wasn't unique to just the war on terror. It existed for far before America entered the fray. Islamic terrorism exists in power voids, a textbook example being the Taliban in Afghanistan. After the Soviet Union pulled out of Afghanistan after a bloody battle, the Taliban came up and filled the power void for them. Islamic terrorism is fundamentally based on instability. Now, this is important because Islamic terrorism, according to Inskeep, was in fragmented sects across all the Middle East. However, with the war on terror, they banded together to create one common enemy. And this is a unifying factor for the Middle East. Because the Islamic State was created, these countries suddenly have to work together to fight a common enemy, meaning Syria, Iraq, Iran, Israel, Jordan, and Egypt have suddenly formed a coalition in order to deal with this problem. And this is good for long-term stability because, as Inskeep goes on to mention, at least dialogue is happening between these countries, which wasn't even happening before America started the war on terror. The war on terror created dialogue between Israel and the Arab world, which can facilitate long-term stability. Now let's look to our second point, which is domestic terrorism in other countries such as Nigeria and Boko Haram, and how America's militaristic policies have forced these countries to take domestic initiative. So if you look to All Africa, a news magazine covering the situation in Africa, we can see that Nigeria has actually pushed back against American intervention. Because of America's militaristic policies in the Middle East, it has created quite an uproar among Middle Eastern countries. They don't want America there. They feel they don't need America there. And they believe that America has actually not contributed much to stamping out Islamic extremism. Nigeria took note of this, and as All Africa in September 2014 stated, they were explicitly denying American requests to assist them because of pushback from their citizens. Let me repeat this. Nigeria's citizens did not want American assistance, which makes perfect sense if you look at America's track record in the Middle East. Now, what does this mean? This means that Nigeria had to combat the issue of Boko Haram not only on its own, but with other countries such as Chad. Now, this is important because Boko Haram, as of now, has been contained. Boko Haram has existed since 2010, and Nigeria and Chad and other sub-Saharan African countries have been able to form a coalition to combat Boko Haram. Now, this is incredibly important because this did not occur when America unilaterally entered the Middle East to try and stomp it out. It was only the Islamic State that forced a coalition. But here, these sub-Saharan African countries have noted America's terrible track record and have been taking a domestic initiative and trying to stamp out domestic terrorism themselves. This is important because this also fosters independence from these countries, which leads to my third point, the end of American hegemony. Now, as the Atlantic states by Kapchan, a professor at Georgetown University, America's rise to global hegemony was not an individual rise. It was a rise facilitated by several partners, such as the European Union and Japan. These have been traditional allies of America, and America has alienated them. Looking at the Kyoto Protocol, an initiative backed very strongly by the European Union and Japan, America's refusal to even listen to agree to the terms of the Kyoto Protocol caused significant dissent between these countries. Looking at, for example, America's alienation of European Union due to the recently unveiled NSA drone surveillance and spying surveillance missions. America has alienated its allies, and this means that American hegemony is falling. Now, this is important because hegemony is bad for not only the weaker powers, but for the hegemons in themselves. As Stokes, professor in international security and strategy at the University of Exeter, states, American hegemony has actually led to dollar decline for America because America has been forced to compete individually against growing markets. Because American hegemony was facilitated by allies in which they have alienated, America suddenly finds itself alone in an increasingly competitive economic market. So, with a decrease in American hegemony, all of a sudden the playing field becomes level. And this is important because a level playing field leads to long-term stability. Because once you have a level playing field without countries trying to assert complete dominance over the others, you are able to have a superior quality of life. And for